impact on oil prices? Why is it just these certain events that have an impact, and how do they have an impact?
There are a few things which happen in this. One is those countries which produce oil, if they are hit in some form or other, then oil prices will go up. But that production is lost to the world. Like suppose there is a problem in Libya or there is a problem in Iran. If the shipments are not coming out, obviously it will have an impact on the price. But the supply is not adequate. So prices will go up. That is a thing which can happen. Particularly in the case of Iran, if there are restrictions posed on countries dealing with Iran for procuring oil, it will have an effect. Prices will go up because that much supply is not available to you. That's an event which is true. Similarly, if there are temporary events which disrupt supplies, that can have a short-term effect on the price. Like you mentioned, Arab Spring. If suppose there is an event which takes place for a month, or Syria for example today, you will find that those events do have an impact on the price. So you will find some events which restrict oil supplies, some events which are of temporary nature, which have an impact on the price.
How do those, those are not directly related to the supply of oil itself, right? Like things like the Arab Spring. So can you help our viewers understand how that would have an impact when they go to the pump?
Actually, market works on two factors. One is the realistic oil prices and the sentiments in the market. Sentiments in the market do have an effect. In fact, it is claimed in 2008 the prices went up to such a level, not necessarily on account of supply and demand issues. There are other factors which were there in that. Similarly, it can have temporarily, if the market feels that supplies could be disrupted, then the prices go up. Or if the market feels that supplies will be more, then prices do come down. But they have a short-term effect, but it can have an effect. They are more on sentiments and less on the production and demand.
This past Friday, oil prices increased again to the highest level in the past 3 weeks. The reason this time is the growing tensions between Iran and the West. While the most basic reason for oil prices going up or coming down is an economic one of supply and demand, any global event that disrupts the process of oil production and distribution will have an impact on prices as well. Since many of the largest oil-producing countries are located in the Middle East, we find that the events taking place there have the biggest impact. In this next report, we take a closer look at the role of OPEC and how the threat of war in the Middle East could have an effect on your daily lives.
The one organization that has the most impact on oil prices is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. It is a group of 13 countries which together produces 40% of the world's oil and claim ownership to most of the Earth's oil reserves. When OPEC wants to increase fuel prices, it simply reduces production. Since many of the OPEC countries are located in the Middle East, oil prices are particularly sensitive to events that take place in that region. The latest focus is, of course, on Iran, which is the world's third largest oil exporter.
But all the while that you have this economic good news, you're beginning to see oil prices rise quite substantially. They're up about 15% over the last few months. And that could put a damper on all this good news. Why is it happening? It's happening for one reason principally: geopolitical risk. The fears of a war over Iran, the fears of crippling sanctions in Iran, which would cut down the Iranian oil exports almost entirely.
Latest reports indicate that Iran's oil exports have dropped by 14% this month. Western sanctions are starting to have an impact as countries reduce reliance on Iranian oil. The banning of Iran's financial institutions has also made it more difficult to engage in any transactions. Saudi Arabia has said it is willing to step up production to make up for the loss in Iranian exports. However, the situation could get out of hand if Iran follows through with its threat to close off the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil passes. If that does happen, we could be seeing Brent crude oil prices shoot up to as high as $240 a barrel. Some experts say this is an unlikely scenario because the stakes are so high. They say it is this threat of chaos unfolding in the Middle East that will help stabilize oil prices.
Because when you look at Iran, that to me, that situation holds the key for aggressive prices to the top side. And when you see Iran still selling oil, it's really not hurting as much, I think, as what the coalition had actually wanted. So I can see this concern or this issue staying with the market for quite some time, keeping prices relatively bull. Take that out of the equation, prices should be lower.
Whatever happens in the conflict between Iran and the West, it will have a fairly direct impact on consumers around the world. In the short term, most economists and industry experts expect to see oil prices increase. Reporting for Global Perspectives, I'm Vaishnavi Velraj from the News First International Desk.
In the second part of our interview with the head of Lanka IOC, Mr. Suresh Kumar, we turn to other global factors affecting global oil prices and other alternatives to meeting the ever-increasing energy demand. Now, after working in Sri Lanka, obviously we have good relations with Iran, but it's very possible that there might be a problem there if sanctions are put into place in Iran. For Sri Lankans, how do you see that impacting our oil needs?
It will have an impact, simply because you will be finding it difficult to deal with Iran as time goes. The restriction that will be imposed on Iran to deal with countries which want oil, or those countries which want to buy oil, they will find it difficult to have a payment mechanism for that. So that will have an effect. It becomes necessary for every country to look for alternative source of oil. Like what we understand today, Japan has cut down the imports from Iran, the other countries have cut down imports from Iran, US has removed them from the sanction list. You will find similar thing happening for other countries if they do not fall in line. So it becomes necessary for Sri Lanka probably to look for alternative sources, which we understand the government is already at it, to look for sources other than Iran for meeting our demand.
In the short term, though, do we have reason to worry, or you think we'll be okay?
I think even what we are looking at, even the short to medium term, we are not really looking at long term. Even in the short to medium term, it can have an impact. If the sanctions do come into effect quite soon, you will find that it has an effect. So probably I think government has already realized it and they are looking for the sources.
And then prices might go up even
Prices
higher?
could go up. Yes, could go up. It can happen because when you go to a non-traditional source, the prices could go up. Yes, it can happen.
Going from that to another thing you mentioned earlier in our chat was renewable energy sources. And I want to ask you, as somebody who's been working in Sri Lanka, what kinds of avenues could we explore in the long term for exploring renewable energy sources?
Sri Lanka, there is phenomenal scope for looking at other forms of energy. Sri Lanka is endowed with natural resources. We have hydro energy, which is there already, which maybe more and more smaller schemes can be tapped, where the levels are not 100 megawatts or more, maybe small ones, 8, 10, 5, whatever, that can be done. Also, we have a lot of natural resources in terms of biomass, which can be encouraged more so for the rural segment. See, there are energy consumption take place in different segments. One is the urban segment, which all of us live. Other the rural segment. As it is, the rural segment doesn't have too much of access to commercial energy. They need to look for alternative energy, which they must be doing it already. You need to channelize it and see how best you can tap that or meet that requirement. So that you will find bulk of that requirement, if it's met through a non-commercial energy or renewable form of energy, you will find that satisfied requirement. Then the commercial energy goes for the industrial segment or the commercial segment, which can afford to pay for that. So we need to probably look at the balance where non-conventional renewable energy can be used, what segments it can be used, how it can be used, and the commercial energy for what segments, which it should be quite possible.
One argument to that people who lived here maybe 10 plus years ago will remember is the great droughts that came in. And people said, since we are so reliant on hydropower, this is the problem that we have because we had like 7-hour power cuts and so forth. What would you say to people who make that argument?
No, I'm not talking about hydro alone as one of the sources. You need to look
but it's a major section of
our...
major
segment.
Yeah.
See, hydro is always used as some kind of a meeting that demand between the peak demand and the stable demand, whatever we call it. That's what it is used for always. Probably you should look at windmills, probably you should look at solar. All the other forms are also there. Again, they may be not year-round energy, but at some point of energy you can use that. So you need to look at the balancing factor of using these forms of energy over and above the commercial energy. So that I think is quite feasible, and Sri Lanka having that endowed with that kind of natural resources, it should be possible. But we need to work a lot harder on those things.
One final question is nuclear power. Our government has expressed interest in exploring the option of nuclear power. Do you think it's a realistic expectation for us to factor that in to some of our energy needs?
It's not unrealistic, but the fact is that these are long gestation projects. You decide to go for a nuclear project today. It takes 10 to 15 years to get the project on the ground. That's something which we need to do, and it's highly capital intensive in the initial. Later energy cost may be less, but at least you need to spend a lot of money putting up the project. That is one which is there in that. Secondly, a lot of factors today, given the global concerns on nuclear safety today, all these issues need to be addressed before a nuclear plant is set up, in terms of safety of the plant and natural calamities which have an impact on the plant itself. Today, I find globally in many countries, there is a lot of public resistance to nuclear plants. These concerns need to be addressed. Without addressing them, it might become difficult for anybody to put up a nuclear plant. Though in the long run it could be a solution, but it's something which needs to be addressed with a lot more attention, a lot more going into the details, without which I think it may be difficult.
Very finally, in the next 3 to 6 months, do you say we can expect to see oil prices increase or decrease?
Very straightforward projection could be oil price could go up.
Go up.
Could go up. For the reason that if there are restrictions imposed on Iran, if other countries cannot get the product, then there is not much scope for the prices to come down. You might only expect an oil price increase simply because supply comes down. That is very reasonable to expect that. So I wouldn't really bet on oil prices coming down.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Suraj Kumar, for taking the time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
On a macro level, increasing oil prices could send the world back into a recession, and governments will have to find ways to deal with such a crisis. For the consumer, increasing oil prices will impact almost every aspect of our lives, everything from electricity and airfare to food prices and bus tickets. While the world may be able to deal with short-term trends in oil prices, experts warn that countries must think about long-term solutions, reminding us that fossil fuel is a limited resource. It will eventually run out. And in the meantime, we're going to have to pay more and more for what is increasingly becoming a precious commodity. And on that somewhat dismal note, we end tonight's edition of Global Perspectives. We'll see you again next week at the same time on MTV Sports. Good night.